I'm Lindsay France. This is Boom Bust, broadcasting around the world from Washington, D.C. Coming up, drug cartels and tourism. They do not go well together. Mexico is a prime example as its tourist businesses take a hit. But it's not alone. A number of countries around the world are experiencing a similar crisis, with violence keeping tourist dollars away. And in China, real estate is hot, and it's time to make a buck. But only if you are in a very special club. We tell you how to get in and if it's even possible to get in. And the probability of a Petro yuan, the American dollar, has dominated oil pricing for 40 years. My guest weighs in on whether China, the largest oil importer in the world, will be successful at changing that. Stand by. Boom Bust starts right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard.
2 months away from closing a year that saw it soar 500%. Bitcoin jumped to more than $6,400 today. And it comes after CME Group said it's set to offer Bitcoin futures. This move could see a tidal wave of investors who have been on standby as the cryptocurrency gains steam. Pending approval from regulators, CME says it plans to launch Bitcoin futures by the end of 2017. 6,400 may sound like a lot, but in Zimbabwe, Bitcoin has soared to over $10,000 in the last week. As national currencies waver, people are flocking to it as a safe haven. Even car dealers now accept it there. How long and arduous could the road to a Petro yuan be for China, the world's largest importer of oil? Well, joining me now is Chris Martenson, the CEO and co-founder of peakprosperity.com. Look, you and I have touched on this. China has made a big move against the dollar. It wants to use gold-backed futures in Shanghai to price oil in yuan. Let's be clear. The petrodollar has dominated 40 years. How viable is this move?
This is a really big move because, as you just mentioned, this isn't just some country. This is China, the world's largest importer of oil, tagging in at 8.6 million barrels a day of imports in 2016. Probably another 400,000 or 500,000 above that. Let's call it 9 million barrels a day. That's roughly 25% of the world's exported and imported oil. This is a really, really big move.
Do you think that something like this has legs? I mean, the idea is nice, but it's in the execution.
Well, it really does have legs. So China has been announcing this for a long time. Yeah. They've unfolded it very carefully. They've run the test marketing on it to make sure that their markets can absorb this. So this is actually a very big move. And I think we have to put this in the context as well. It was last May 2017 where the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia went and visited China. I was talking with a gentleman who was there at that delegation from a panel I serve on. And he said it wasn't just a few people from Saudi Arabia showing up. They brought in 6 full cars that were, the king's personal private cars, 150 chefs. They inked $65 billion in deals, everything from healthcare to IT, you name it. So this was a real pivot of Saudi Arabia and China towards each other in this story. It's a very big deal.
Well, it's not only that, Saudi Arabia and Russia now, with the recent visit there. And of course, Saudi Arabia, as it does so well, going to be honest, lots of posturing, the chefs, the cars, the big show, taking over hotels, what have you. But it's at a new precedent. It's making a big statement.
Well, it absolutely is. And if we look at the scope and the breadth, not just the size of these deals that they're inking with Moscow now, this was, by the way, the first visit ever by a royal delegation from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, to Moscow. So that's a first. And they didn't, again, this wasn't just about the oil, but it's a very big part of the story. Russia is now busy looking to help Saudi Arabia in areas of building nuclear power plants, agreed to sell them the S-400 missile system. That's an anti-aircraft system. That means Russia, they don't sell that to somebody they don't consider to be a long-term partner because it's something you wouldn't personally want to go up against after you sold it to somebody. So very big deals. And of course, I think this comes on the heels of the United States having its shale miracle really dialing down its purchase of Saudi Arabian oil. Saudi Arabia is looking for long-term partners in this story.
But let's talk about a little bit of recreation here. One of the petrodollar's major strengths is that those investment flow, it all flows back into the United States. It also allows for a huge, it allows us to run huge deficits. And so is this the same situation that China could be looking at? I mean, how would it even avoid this and not replicate it?
It's an exorbitant privilege, of course, to have the world's reserve currency, and the petrodollar is a really big piece of that. Since 2000, roughly $7 trillion US dollar equivalents have been accumulated by oil exporting nations. Now, they don't hold all of that in cash or something like that in their central bank. They're recycling a lot of that back into US markets, as you mentioned, but it means the United States has been able to export roughly $7 trillion of debts and deficits to other nations. They've accumulated those. It's an exorbitant privilege to be able to do that. Now, China, slightly different story. Their capital markets aren't yet open. They cracked it open a little bit with the idea that you could purchase gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange for yuan, priced in yuan, and even repatriate that gold if you wanted to. But in the meantime, what China is seeking to do is get itself away from the dollar, begin to establish itself as a petro yuan in this case, which they can do given their position. And then for the oil exporting nations, they have a decision. Do I really want to hold this many yuan? Well, sure, because China sells a lot of things that everybody wants to buy. So it's a very, very big move, very underreported in the United States and Western media right now.
Well, we've also got to talk about the geopolitics involved. If this catches on the petro yuan, what about producers like Saudi Arabia and the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, who originally, back in the 70s, agreed on pricing it to the dollar?
Not just that, Lindsay, but I'm sure you know this, but for your listeners, they priced in the dollar and then also kept those dollars in the United States in large measure. So when we look at Saudi Arabia's foreign reserves or things like that, much of that's held in New York City. And so it was a two-for deal. The United States is going to help Saudi Arabia be militarily protected. We're going to help them remain stable in a very unstable part of the world. That they are now inking military deals for things like the missile system I mentioned, but other military hardware with China and Russia. That's a very large pivot, saying that they are now going to be spreading their bets at least across 2 or 3 parties instead of just one. That's a huge deal.
Well, you were just at the New Orleans investment conference. You were around a lot of colleagues, people you know. What were their reactions to this?
Well, there was a lot of agreement that this is one of the most underreported stories right now. This is an enormous seismic shift in the petrodollar itself and for the reserve currency status of the United States. Nobody thinks that the dollar is just going to go away all at once, but it's the erosion. That's what's actually started at this point in time. And what was particularly noted was that China is running a very different policy. We could call that the magic checkbook policy. The United States is still running gunboat diplomacy, as it were, and China is making huge inroads with this at this point in time. And again, everybody there was pretty much in agreement that this needs to be understood because it's a very seismic shift in how things have been operating for 45 years.
Right, I'd say. Well, let's pivot now to OPEC. I've got to ask you about this. Cuts are going to extend possibly to through 2018. Stemming that glut and raising prices hasn't proven to be as successful as they'd originally hoped. Prices rising, it took a long, long time. What about the countries that are in OPEC or associates of OPEC, like Libya, Nigeria, the ones who aren't really held to the same standard, citing their domestic problems, but they just keep pumping? Do you see this changing? Do you see them being, having their feet held to the fire at some point to help OPEC out more?
It's been very difficult for that to actually happen so far. If you look at the OPEC 13, who are still the major exporters, and you track their numbers, they're up about 2 million barrels a day from 3 years ago. They're wobbling around. The so-called cuts, you can't find it really, obviously, in the macro data across all 13. So we knew that Libya was going to come back online. We knew that Nigeria had some issues. We know that Iraq needed to sell more. These are troubled countries that need the income. So it's been very hard to corral them. The truth is, though, I'm looking for this next year. The rebalancing is almost done. We see lots of signs of economic growth all around the world. We're seeing it in the United States. We're seeing it in China. That growth requires oil. This rebalancing is going to actually catch people by surprise because I think OPEC is pumping pretty much flat out. I think demand is going to outstrip supply starting in another quarter or maybe two.
We're going to bring you on to talk about the outcome of your hypothesis. Thank you so much.